The city woke with the hiss of chem rain and the soft, relentless chime of nano-wind cowers swaying in the morning air. It was a city that wore light like a second skin, all glass and photon veins, a place where memory could be handled the way other cities handled water. Filtered, bottled, sold in precise increments. In the older districts, near the harbor where salt still clung to the air, and the gulls wore exoskeletons of steel in their beaks. A new thing stirred in a clinic called Axiom's Glass. It was not a patient exactly, yet it was. It was a life that woke and began to speak in voices that did not belong to the moment's body, but to someone else's future. The patient's name, they later learned, was Eira Noé, though few would have believed that a name mattered when the body was a collage of borrowed cells and cloned memories, stitched together with care that would have impressed a surgeon's conscience, if such a thing still existed. Eira woke with a tremor under the skin, a tremble that was not fear, but a whispering of possibilities. The clinic ceiling was a pale, pearly field, a frost-lit horizon that did not exist in the ordinary world. The voices did not come in one at a time. They came in a chorus that sounded not like a chorus, but a library of futures. Each memory from a different possible day, each sentence, a ripple across a pond that did not belong to any one person. Voices began as soft, almost musical tones. A woman's voice, clear and cool, said, "You are nothing you think you are. There is a future where you do nothing at all, and a future where you are more than your maker dreamt." A man's voice followed, flatter, almost bored. "You will remember the city's second sunrise if you let it in. You will forget it if you do not fight." Then a child spoke in a whisper that fractured like glass. "Don't listen to them. They will tell you who you are, but you are the one who will tell them who they are." Eira blinked, as if to clear smoke from her eyes, except the smoke was memory itself, memories that did not belong to a single era. The clinic's antiseptic whiteness did not dazzle her. It felt like being wrapped in the lid of a glass box, shaped like a head. The doctors spoke in measured, luminous syllables about memory crystallization, about donor and clone, about a new grammar of self that would be written not by parents, but by the hum of nanites and the ethics committee's careful, candle-lit debate. In the midst of the awakening, a figure appeared at the periphery of her sight, the figure of a person who did not seem to be part of the room's dimensions, or perhaps the room itself did not belong to the person. They wore a coat that shimmered like the surface of a river at midnight, and their eyes held a map of cities she could not place. They introduced themselves as Kai, no surname given, though a brand of data industry claim hovered around them like a halo. "Welcome to the archive of possible selves," Kai said. And the words tasted like rain on stone. The crystallization you underwent did not simply store your memories. It braided them with memories not your own, futures you might inhabit depending on what you decide with them. The voices you hear are not random echoes. They are the futures that are trying to become you. That line settled in a place inside Eira that felt both frightened and curiously exhilarated. The idea of futures pressing against present tense was intoxicating and terrifying in the same breath. Like standing on a cliff and discovering there is water on both sides, one side deep and one side more deep still, with the cliff's edge smeared by the glow of a world she hadn't dreamed existed. The clinic did not merely host patient care. It housed a new kind of trial, a social experiment that pretended to be medicine. The sign outside the glass box of the building bore a single word that, in other circumstances, would have seemed commercial and banal: crystallize. It promised transformation with surgical precision, a cure for something unspoken, perhaps the modern fear that life is not something you own, but a sequence of mutable choices you can trade, borrow, or recycle. Mira Kest did not consider herself a soldier in a war, and certainly not in a war she imagined as a war of memory. She was an augmented, outcast coder, a living circuitry with a laugh that sounded too loud for a world that had grown quiet about the raw, urgent questions of selfhood. Her implants, Microchips that lived under her skin and ran the code of 1,000 tiny lives were not a symbol of power, but a stubborn refusal to forget the lies the old world told about coherence and control. Mira's assignment arrived through the city's invisible channels. A dossier slid under her door that looked like a page torn from a future. The dossier's cover announced in minimal serif, "Surveillance of Memory Crystallization Trials, the Glass Archive, 2.3.7. They wanted audit, they wanted precision. They wanted to know whether the mind could be carefully supervised, the way a river can be dammed or rerouted. They wanted Mira to audit the process of crystallization, to examine the trials of donors and clones as if the mind's construction were a factory process where every bolt and needle could be checked, tightened, and recalibrated. She arrived at the Glass Archive with a bag that contained a single tool, a translator of neural traces, a device that could read the crystalline resonance of memory and translate it into a map of emotional weather. The building hummed with a quiet energy, as if a million micro-ideas were sleeping beneath the floors and one alarm away from waking into a parade. Inside, rows of glass vaults held crystal memory cores, memory in the shape of small, translucent shards that caught light and then refracted it into endless little rainbows. The staff wore white suits that were spotless to the point of abstraction, as if they were born clean and remained so by wetting every edge with antiseptic purpose. The atmosphere smelled faintly of ozone and vanilla, an odd, almost comforting fragrance that did not belong to a hospital, but to a temple. Mira met Dr. Lysa Karm, the clinic's lead physician, who looked at Mira the way one studies a device one cannot quite place. Dr. Karm had a way of tilting her head when listening to someone that suggested she could hear the currents of the city itself, the way a seabird hears the undertow. "Mira," Dr. Karm said, smiling with the gentleness of someone who has done this sort of thing many times and still believes it matters. "You've augmented perception. You know how to listen to signals that others do not hear. Here, we listen to memories as if they were weather patterns, the rain of a single day, the storm birthed by a lifetime." Mira nodded, though the phrase felt both poetic and dangerous in a place where the truth of someone's mind could be turned into a product or a risk. Her job would be to audit the platform that held the memory cores, to ensure the ethical delinking occurred when necessary, to verify that the donor and clone narratives did not fuse into a single, monopolized voice that could rewrite the self. The trials were real and not. A first memory core Mira accessed belonged to a patient named Eshin, a man who had volunteered for the crystalline process in order to fix a deficit of agency he felt in his own life, the sense that he could never decide for himself because time would decide for him first. When the memory core was opened, it wasn't a memory, but a field of possibilities, a panorama of dozens of futures that tried to push themselves into the patient's bloodstream. Each memory shimmered, not as a memory of a day, but as a potential day that could be lived if the right conditions existed. What Mira saw there was not a single memory of a person, but a narrative map of a person's possible selves. Each self anchored to a specific outcome. The donor's life preferred by the donor, the clone's life chosen by the cell's logic to reproduce a lineage, or a refined kind of ideal. In some of these maps, the person grew into an artist who painted with light. In others, they became a researcher who danced with dangerous equations until they could no longer distinguish measurement from meaning. And in some, a quiet, almost invisible life of ordinary days, mornings of coffee and rain, and the drift of a life that never tried to reinvent itself. As she pored over more memory cores, she encountered something unsettling. A pattern that repeated in many cores, a convergence where memories traced themselves into a single core's weather, and the weather began to overtake the person's actual present. The donor versus clone question, the central ethical hinge of this project, played out in recurring motifs. A memory of a parent's face, a memory of a lover's last words, a memory of a child's first breath, all of which could be borrowed or borrowed back to create a new self that was simultaneously someone else's. In the midst of her audit, a young nurse named Juno whispered in Mira's ear, a habit born from the city's sideways smiles and 2 loud radios. "The voices trouble you," Juno said, eyes flicking toward the glass vaults like moths attracted to a light they should not approach. "They do trouble some people more than others. The voices do not arrive by accident, they arrive as a warning. Do not mistake yourself for the map you hold." Mira did not reply. The discrepancy between what the mind told itself and what the crystals held was a habit of this work, a dance that Mira knew too well. She had learned to recognize the small tells of a mind trying to dodge a truth it didn't want to see. When a memory is more real than reality, when the line between donor and clone becomes a wandering thread that could either knit something beautiful or unravel the body's sense of a single self. Meanwhile, in a different wing of the city's glassy architecture of healing and ambition, Eira's awakening deepened into a more complicated form of listening. The voices did not merely whisper, they debated each other inside the chamber of her own skull. A male voice argued for keeping the future at bay, for protecting the present from the risk of becoming something else. A female voice urged the opposite, insisting that the future was not a threat, but an invitation to redesign the self with broader colors and more daring textures. Another voice, so soft it scarcely seemed human, urged caution, reminding Eira that memory is a weapon as easily turned to harm as to healing. In the days that followed, Eira's body began to awaken in a half-lit manner. Eyelids fluttering in the quiet arithmetic of sleep, she dreamt in languages she did not recognize at first, then recognized as familiar, like listening to a friend speak in a dialect you forgot you knew. Dreams offered a grid for an experiment she hadn't asked for, but whose consequences would define the rest of her life. What if the voices were not stepping on her toes, but stepping on other people's toes in their sleep? What if the future's voices were not a warning, but a permission slip, a key to doors she hadn't realized existed? The clinic kept a careful watch on her, as it did with all its patients who carried the risk of being overridden by a future that preferred a different self. The staff used the most modern methods of care to isolate, to cushion, to help. Yet the more Eira listened, the more she realized that the voices were not simply intrusions. They were conversations about whether she would become something the world could love or something the world would fear. Kai, the figure in the coat with the shifting eyes, began to appear with increasing regularity. It was never at a scheduled time. It simply happened. As she woke to a moment when a memory shard's light would flicker and the figure would stand in the doorframe or at the edge of a dream. "Your future self is not a thing you own," Kai told her one late afternoon as the clinic's windows showed a rainstorm coming in from the bay, turning the city into a carousel of rain. "But you are your future self when you decide to act, when you choose to protect or discard the futures offered to you." Their conversations were not merely philosophical discomforts. They carried practical gravity. If a future self refused a memory or demanded it be saved, what would that do to the present self? If the future self insisted on a memory's erasure to protect the present's balance, could a person be their own history's custodian? If a future self demanded more space in one body, would the body survive the intrusion? All these questions pressed against Eira's consciousness, like the cold air in a freezer. The gaseous city, with its light-bleached towers and the quiet glow of biotech congregations, did not respond well to questions that could tear its social fabric. The community around crystallization was a curious blend of idealists and realists, of people who believed in the sanctity of memory as a sacred shard, and people who believed memory could be a commodity to be traded or sold to those who needed it most. The more Eira listened to her own future, the more she realized that the world outside the glass archive would not tolerate a self that refused itself. In the same period, a separate thread of this story began to pull at Mira's attention with a deliberate, pull-your-hair-out insistence. A consciousness thief, someone who did not want to inherit a single self, but to borrow the traits of many minds and to trade them in for power. Made a move in the city's undernet. The thief traveled through the city's memory circuits, the way a thief in the night travels through alleyways. Quietly, efficiently, with a heat of cunning in their steps. They infiltrated the trust lines of the memory bank system, trading stolen traits from one memory core to another, turning personality markers into a currency that could buy influence, control, or fear. The thief wore a disguise that was not a disguise at all. It was an ensemble of bracelets and rings that sparkled with microcrystal codes. They spoke rarely, but when they did, their voice fell into the air with a metallic coolness, as if it came from a trans-dimensional speaker, rather than a living throat. They did not need to show themselves to the public to achieve their ends. They needed to demonstrate to the city that the line between oneself and another was not only blurred, but bendable. A property of reality that could be manipulated at will. The society's fear grew, as fear always does, the fear of losing what makes you, you. The outcry was loud and a little farcical, a chorus of people who claimed the collective self could never be something good, or they claimed the self could be enhanced by sharing memory in a cooperative network. There were arguments about whether a donor's memories could or should belong to a clone, whether the line between I and we could survive contact with a network that allowed the mind to borrow and lend itself like a library. Mira found these arguments maddening and fascinating in equal measure. She was not inherently opposed to collaboration or shared risk, but she could not ignore the danger of the thief. The thief's aim would not be satisfied by simply stealing a trait here and there. That would be petty. The thief's aim would be to reframe the world's concept of self as an accessible resource. The new product, the commodity that any buyer could purchase by trading away part of their individuality. The first explicit attack occurred as a breach into one of the clinic's most secure membranes, the core vault, the central memory core, where the most sensitive donor clone data rested. The thief's intrusion manifested as a rain of submemories, little shards that did not belong to anyone but could be combined to form a mind's most private hours. It was as if someone took the private diaries of 1,000 people and sold them to a single buyer who could assemble a person's character from that mosaic. The event sent shockwaves through the city, because it proved that the mind could be mass-produced or mass-manipulated in a way the world had not anticipated. The crisis forced a reckoning for Eira as well as for Mira. The staff attempted to seal the breach, to isolate the stolen memories and the corrupt memories that had been fused with others. But the virus of stolen traits did not obey simple containment protocols. It refused to be quarantined, slipping through the cracks with gleeful, malicious energy. Kai appeared in Eira's room again, but this time not as a quiet observer, but as an ally who could be trusted begrudgingly. They spoke in a voice that carried the weight of a plan that would test the tremor of faith, the temper of caution, the line between oath and forgetfulness. Kai spoke as if words themselves could bend fate into new shapes. "Listen," he said, stepping closer to the lamp that flickered on the desk, throwing half-formed shadows across Eira's mats and photographs of the city's bones. He spoke slowly, choosing each syllable with a surgeon's care. "This is not a rescue mission. It's a crack in a dam. We give the people something they can drink, truth in a way they can swallow without choking." Eira's chair creaked in response, the sound like a distant gull breaking from the water. She kept her eyes on the paper streets sprawled across the table, the city drawn in lines of light and shadow. In their youth, they'd both believed the city was a machine that would keep them safe, a machine that could be tuned if you only had the right letters and the right key. Now she saw the machine as something older, heavier, and more patient. The city didn't break because someone pulled a lever. It wore down from 1,000 tiny decisions, from 1,000 tiny betrayals, from the uncounted seconds of fear that turned people into something else entirely. Kai's gaze rested on her with the gravity of a man who had learned too late that trust is a weapon as much as a shield. He had the air of someone who had seen the underside of mercy and found it wanting. But he carried a stubborn spark of stubborn hope that could be coaxed, if they were careful. "The archive," he said, naming the target as if the word alone would conjure the thing. Not the public records, the archive beneath the dome, the heart of the city's memory. They keep a copy of every memory that ever passed through the gate, every choice that the overseers decided mattered. They don't publish them, not exactly. They encode them into the walls themselves, so that if you know the right rhythm, you can hear the city speak back to you. Eira leaned forward, fingers tracing the perimeter of a photograph where a long line of lights in the distance wove like a river through the metropolis. The dome. She remembered the dome, the constant hum of its surveillance, a city within a city, an arc with a lid that never quite shut. She remembered nights when the street lanterns pulsed in a way that suggested a heartbeat beneath the asphalt. She remembered the chill of the morning air, when the sky had that pale, unanswerable gray that reminded her of an unspoken warning. "People don't understand what you're offering," she said finally. "Not yet. They've learned to live with the fog, the omnipresent tease of truth that never lands. You want to release something that can't be unsaid, something that will burn from the inside out. They'll either rise and burn with you, or be consumed by the flame." Kai's mouth curled into a small, wry smile, the kind that suggested he'd learned to laugh through pain. "That's the point," he said. "They'll see what they've allowed to be done in their name. Not what the overseers pretend to do, not what the current stories tell them. Real truth isn't neat, Eira. It's messy and dangerous and liberating and frightening all at once. It makes people act, sometimes in ways they never imagined." The plan, he explained, would hinge on 3 acts that must unfold like a carefully choreographed dance. First, they would assemble a chorus of witnesses, 2 kinds. The unseen, the people who lived in the frame of the city but never spoke aloud about what they'd seen. And the outward, the people who thrived on the edge of the city's rumor mill. Those who could spread a rumor into a fact with a small pivot in a social feed. They would gather 5 voices who had glimpsed the truth when the power hiccuped, 5 souls who could move minds as surely as a river moves stones. Second, they would create a corridor in the network, a crack in the city's data lattice. It would not be a weapon in the rude sense, no physical breach, no artillery, but a choreography of signals. A melody of frequencies that would coax the city's memory to remember something it had learned to forget. It would bend the city's own attention for a moment, like a door swinging briefly inward in a silent room, allowing a rush of honest memory to flood in where fear had once stood sentinel. Third, they would use a decoy, the archive's own ritual, the way it was built to be opened on specific nights by a certain pattern of actions, the kind of ritual that never asks for permission but demands performance. They would perform it with exactitude, not to steal information, but to reveal the pattern that allowed the overseers to hide the truth in plain sight. It would be a public performance of restraint and truth, a mass action that felt like both baptism and confession. "Where do we start?" Eira asked, the words rusting on her tongue as if she hadn't spoken aloud in weeks. "With the people," Kai answered. "We start with them, where they sleep and wake, where they talk in stairwells and laundries and bus depots, where they tell each other stories that might be true or might be a warning. We start with the people who've learned to listen for the city's heartbeat, but never dared to call it by its name." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then he added in a lower voice, almost as if he were confessing to the room rather than to her, "We'll need someone who can translate fear into movement, someone with a face people want to trust, someone with no power but enough stubbornness to wrestle a decision from chaos." Eira's eyes flashed with a quiet, stubborn light. She had learned long ago that a plan without warmth would never survive the fire of reality. "If we're calling this a chorus," she said, "we'll need instruments. Those who can read the weave, those who can listen to the city's memories, as if they were spoken aloud, and not just felt. We'll need someone who can push back against the way the overseers eclipse the truth with their rituals, and we'll need a map. A map of where the city's heart is beating loudest, Kai said, tapping a finger on a blank corner of the table. A map of where people still harbor a stubborn defiance, where the memory of a different life lizzes through the air like electricity. The two of them sat in a silence that was not empty, but pregnant with the many attempts of their pasts to converge into a common future. Outside, the city was a pale creature, coughing in the cold air, its glassy skin dotted with the glow of 1,000,000 screens and lanterns. The dome loomed above it, a muted moon of alloy and glass, watching with patient indifference. Eira looked down at the desk, at a cluster of names she'd scribbled in a notebook. The ones who had glimpsed something true and chosen to hide it. The ones who had chosen to speak and found themselves silenced. The ones who had learned to wait until the noise moved past them. They were not much, on their own a pair of tremulous sparks in a vast dark room. But together they could become a fire that would not easily be put out. "We won't do this only with arguments," she said finally. "We'll do it through a shared memory, something that feels like a memory of a life you could have had. If we can do that, the city will remember, and memory has a way of choosing sides when it wakes up." The rest of that night passed with the soft, almost ritualistic tempo of a plan taking shape. They moved through the room as if the furniture were a map, where every object signaled a potential path toward the archive. A lamp was moved to a corner for better light. A chair that blocked the doorway was shifted aside with a reluctant creak. The photographs, faces that bore neither smiles nor frowns, but the quiet, unspoken burden of surviving, were lined up, as if they could be coaxed into speaking by the placement of their own shadows. In the following days, their alliance grew in stealth and careful subtlety. Kai's memories of the city's earlier rebellions, how the first spark of dissent had died because it couldn't find a single flame to feed it, became a vocabulary they used with minimal explanation. They began to test the plan in small, controlled ways. The first step involved a man named Jory, a forward courier who had learned to read the city's signals the way a musician reads a score. Jory had the kind of face that did not demand respect, and yet carried the weight of the trust he had earned through years of quiet, faithful service. He moved through the markets at night, where the air smelled of rain and copper and something ancient that might have been incense or rust. He could move among the market stalls without drawing attention, listening for the people's murmurs, catching the edges of fear before it became loud enough to draw the watch's notice. Jory listened for the tremor in the city's memory, the micro-shock that happened whenever someone remembered something that could threaten the dome. He found 5 individuals who had glimpsed a pattern in the city's memory. One who had heard a whispered phrase from the archive itself when the lights briefly flashed out during a power maintenance night. Another who had watched the dome's shadow pass over a square and seen something that felt like a hidden room behind the glass. A third who had practiced the old songs of rebellion in a place where songs were banned. A fourth who had been a builder of the city's old bridges. A person who had learned to listen to the way the city's joints creaked when something changed. And a fifth who had once shipped forbidden records on a bicycle that never seemed to stop moving. Kai and Eira met each of them in different neighborhood corners, listening to their stories, testing their willingness to act. The first, a woman named Farah, had a voice that could still carry a rumor with the delicate force of a breeze through a forest. The rumor she carried was old but potent, that the weave, the memory of the city, was not a parasite to be avoided, but a living thing that could be coaxed to reveal itself, if you asked it nicely and with enough courage. She had never believed in heroes. She believed in small, stubborn acts of resistance, like feeding a neighbor when the city rationing was at its worst, or preserving a memory in a jar that the overseers would never notice. The second, a man named Bram, was a technician who had once supervised the city's power lines before a crackdown that had forced him into exile within the old bus tunnels beneath the city. Bram spoke in the language of copper and current, and he saw the archive as a kind of conductor's baton, something that could be used to orchestrate an entire city's memory, rather than simply store it away. He had the cold eyes of someone who'd learned to calculate risk and then throw himself into the math anyway, because not doing so was a kind of treason. The third, a former teacher named Lysa, carried with her a stubborn optimism that Proudhon's old books could still be read if you found the right angle of light. She had a way of distilling fear into simple, practical steps, a way of turning a complicated threat into a checklist. The fourth, a craftsman named Miro, understood architecture as a language. The dome's bones were more than steel and glass. They were a grammar, a set of rules that could be exploited if you spoke them with enough cunning. The fifth, a courier named Nico, moved through the city with a boyish impatience and the aura of someone who could charm information out of a locked room with a single smile. As they spoke in small circles beneath peeling posters from a past that felt more like a dream than a memory, a curious transformation unfolded. Their fear softened into purpose, and their skepticism settled into a stubborn, almost religious, belief in the possibility of a more honest city. The second act, carving a corridor in the data lattice, proved to be the most delicate. It required a choreography of actions, a procedure that looked like a performance, but was, in truth, a precise manipulation of the weave that connected memory to memory. Eira stood with her back against a wall of an abandoned station, listening to the distant pulse of the city as if it were a living creature breathing through the iron and stone. She could feel the threads of the weave, a soft, throat-cool sensation that crawled along the skin. A reminder that memory was never simply stored, but alive and listening. The plan involved a ritual of sorts, a sequence of steps performed at the very moment the dome's central network was rebooting, an event that happened on a timetable known only to a few. They would appear to do ordinary things, but their ordinary actions would align with a larger pattern that would vibrate the weave into a resonance. The effect would be invisible to most, or at least to most who cared to look, but it would act like a musical overture, inviting the memory itself to wake up and listen. On the night of the first test, they gathered in a derelict hall that had once served as a meeting place for neighborhood organizers before the city's iron-willed rulers had silenced such gatherings. The hall smelled of old rain and rust, of rain that had fallen years ago but left its memory in the floorboards. They laid out their plan with the exactness of a surgical drill and the simplicity of a child's game. Each person had a role and a rhythm, to speak only when their turn came, to listen carefully, to maintain a posture of calm, even as the air thickened with tension. Farah would begin, her voice low and clear, telling a story that wasn't merely a memory, but a map. Graham would calibrate the instruments, the decoy signal amplifiers they'd hidden in plain sight inside old maintenance crates. Lysa would serve as a translator, describing to the others how the memory's patterns looked when you touched them, and Miro would oversee the structural integrity of the city's mental architecture, ensuring that the weave didn't collapse under the weight of fear. Nico would carry a small, almost innocuous box, the kind that looked like it might contain a snack or a toy, but beneath its veneer lay a lattice of micro-drones and signal relays designed to ride on the city's data currents and scatter their words into places where they could be heard by those who most needed to hear them. They began with a small, almost ceremonial act, the opening of a memory that wasn't theirs to tell, but belonged to every citizen. Farah told the first story, a memory of a night when the city's power flickered, and for a moment, people forgot to fear the watchful eyes in the dome. The memory itself was not a triumphant event, but a simple, human moment of shared breath. A mother lifting a child's face toward the window to show that the night could still be beautiful, even when the city's rules told them to stay quiet. The memory's beauty lay in the way it surged through the room, softening lines of worry and turning them into possibilities. As the memory spread, they saw the subtle change in the room's air, a tremor that seemed almost like a sigh. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was something real. The memory reached a corner where Bram had hidden his devices, and the devices hummed with a new life, as if they heard the memory themselves and decided to echo it. The third act, the public performance, came with the risk of exposure. If the overseers detected it, every member of the chorus would be branded traitor, and their families punished in ways that went beyond the ordinary retribution. They would vanish into the city's maze of tunnels, or be forced to register as dissidents and live under continuous surveillance. They would be forced to inhale fear every day of their lives until fear became their only language. Yet the act had to be performed. The city needed to hear the truth in a voice that wasn't a fear-stricken whisper, but a confident, patient, almost gentle insistence that life could be different. The first public sound, if one could call it sound, emerged not as a shout, but as a momentary turning of the air in a corridor. A shift that might have been mistaken for the result of a draft, but was in fact the weave answering a call. The signal was faint and almost accidental, a breath of memory that found its way into a city-wide feed and lingered there for a fraction of a breath longer than the moment it was released. It wasn't enough to disrupt the dome. It wasn't yet a roar that could rattle the watchers' cages. But it was enough to shake a few people out of their routine, to rouse a handful of hearts that still remembered what it meant to believe in something besides the fear of punishment. The first public responders, Rena, a nurse who worked in a clinic that served a district with the city's most crowded trains, and Theo, a factory worker who patched the city's noise from 100 different machines, were drawn into a quiet, almost sacred conversation by the signal's suggestion of something better than the life they had learned to endure. They did not know what it was that called them, only that there was a tug at the edge of their thoughts. The sense that something they'd forgotten could be remembered again. Rena spoke softly, asking questions that were not designed to entrap, but to reconnect people with their own experiences. Have you ever stood where the city breathes and heard the breath return to you? Have you ever felt the moment when the night silence stops pretending and becomes something that matters? Theo replied with practical clarity. If this is a trap, it's a trap that invites you to walk through it anyway. If it's a rescue, the rescue isn't from strangers. It's from the fear that keeps you still when you could move. As more voices joined the chorus, the city began to murmur back, not with rhetoric or bravado, but with a quiet, persistent insistence, the memory of a life where people could speak, could act, could choose the future. The movement grew not as a shout, but as a soft, persistent drift of wind that carried with it the sense that something constant could be recovered, even if only for a moment. But with growth came danger. The overseers noticed the tremor in the weave, noticed the way certain patterns began to break free from the grid that had always held them in check. The dome's watchful eyes, attuned to even the slightest break in the city's discipline, began to fix on the hall where the chorus gathered, as if their world could be measured by the rhythm of their steps. The watchers came with the careful, practiced silence of a stalking predator. Their presence announced more by the crouched shoulders of the crowd than by the red lights of their uniforms. They did not step into the room yet, but the fear in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Kai, Eira, and their 5 witnesses were aware of the danger that approached. They did not have the luxury to pretend that this was not happening. They felt the weight of what could happen if the plan failed, yet fear could not drive them. Fear could only remind them that they were alive and that life deserved to be defended. They pressed on, their alliance knit tighter by the shared risk. They would need to be ready for whatever came next, the test of loyalty, the sacrifice of personal safety, the possibility that one misstep would unravel everything they'd begun. That night, after the memory had drifted through the city's wires and the 5 witnesses had been moved to a safer location by a discreet network of volunteers that the weave somehow summoned into existence, Kai and Eira stood at the door of the derelict hall and watched the city's dark skin turn a shade of gray as morning pressed itself over the horizon. The dome remained a silent witness above them, its silhouette a reminder of what they were up against and of what they hoped to accomplish. "Do you feel it?" Eira asked softly, not turning to him. "Feel what?" Kai asked. "The city waking up. It's not a collective roar yet. It's a tremor under a carpet, but it's there." Kai nodded, eyes narrowing in thought. "It's a beginning. The weave is not a weapon. It's a memory. If we can teach people to remember without fear, they'll decide what to do with that memory. They did not talk for long. Their words were enough to anchor the plan in a shared sense of purpose, but the work lay ahead. More meetings, more careful handoffs, more moments when the city would test them, and they would test the city in return. Over the next days, the plan moved into its more dangerous phase, a confrontation with the governors of the dome themselves, the decision-makers who had erased the memory of certain people's lives with the same casual ease that they trimmed their own budgets. They would need to infiltrate a place known to outsiders as a sanctified space, the archives, where any memory that disagreed with the dome's narrative was supposed to be locked away, not just away, but permanently erased. It was the heart of the city's memory, its living library, a place that was supposed to be immune to the city's quicksilver changes, and yet, paradoxically, the one place they believed the truth could be forced to kneel before. The ascent toward that point was a climb through a maze of vertiginous staircases and subterranean corridors, a journey through ventilation shafts that hummed with cold air and the soft, almost affectionate whisper of distant machines. They moved in small teams, careful to avoid drawing attention. They wore clothes that would not look out of place on a worker or a maintenance technician, an aesthetic of normalcy that could pass through security checks without triggering alarms. In one of the tunnels, they ran into a patrol. It was not a full squad, just a pair, one of them young, one of them old enough to know better than to push too hard or to show their fear openly. They passed by with barely a glance and did not stop to ask questions. The city's memory had already trained people to notice the faintest irregularities, the way a door's hinge sang when a person's breathing grew uneven, the way a light seemed to flicker when someone spoke a secret aloud in a crowded room. The plan's risky element lay in timing. They had to reach the archive not only unseen, but unseen at the exact moment when the dome's central reboot would occur. They needed to insert the Weave's invitation into that reboot, not disrupt the reboot itself, which would be too easy to detect, and would alert the overseers far too quickly to their mistake. They would be performing in front of a system that did not allow performances that spoke too loudly, a system that preferred silence to truth. The moment of entry was the hardest. The archive's gates were not locked in the sense of physical locks. They were guarded by a digital lattice that responded to patterns, a language of light and heat that could tell whether the right people were standing in the right place at the right time to speak the right words. The 5 witnesses became a chorus of quiet, each one contributing a piece of the utterance that could unlock the door, not by force, but by embracing the truth so intimate that it could not be denied once it was heard. When the moment came, it arrived with a hush that felt almost sacramental. The lights in the corridor dimmed to a pale, almost luminescent blue. The air grew cooler, and the faint, distant sound of a breath, perhaps the city's own, perhaps something deeper, seemed to come from the walls themselves. It was as if the archive were listening, and the room was answering back. They began with Farah's voice, a steady, fearless cadence that spoke of ordinary lives and ordinary courage. Her words did not declare a revolution, but proposed a memory, a possibility, a different way of looking at the world that had long been hidden behind fear's curtain. The words rose and fell in the corridor like a voice that did not want to be heard, but could not be suppressed any longer. Then Bram's voice joined, crisp and technical, but carrying with it a warmth that surprised them all. He spoke of the city's vulnerabilities not as failures, but as opportunities for resilience. He explained in precise terms how to listen to the weave and how to respond to it in a way that would not trigger the dome's automatic silencing, but would instead invite the memory to step forward into the light. Lysa followed, speaking of human memory as something that could be cherished rather than feared, something that could be shared rather than hoarded. Her words reminded them that even in a city built on surveillance, there were still individuals who remembered what it felt like to be free, who remembered what it felt like to dream. She offered a vision of a future in which memory and community could co-create a life that would survive the dome's gaze. Miro's voice, quiet and insistent, spoke of structure and form, the architecture of trust, the architecture of risk, the architecture of a plan that could hold together even when the world turned against it. He described the weave as a living lattice of memory that could be coaxed to reveal itself without becoming dangerous. The trick, he explained, was to give memory room to breathe, to let fear fall away enough to let truth in. Nico's voice, eager and bright with the electricity of someone who lived for movement and turnings of the city's currents, added the final piece, a rhythm by which the 5 voices could be synchronized to reach the gateway at precisely the right moment. He described the decoy mechanisms, the microdrones and signal relays that would give the memory a vehicle for travel across the city's mindscape, so that the weave would not be a single thread, but a chorus that could sing through the dome's walls and be heard by the people who had grown up believing that truth was something the dome would never tolerate. And then, behind them all, in the shadow of their plan's culmination, stood Eira, not a conductor of this chorus, but a guardian of its heart. Her eyes spoke of a quiet certainty that she could not completely put into words, a sense that the city's memory would find its own way to the surface, if they could only hold it up long enough for the world to see it. What happened next, as they crossed into the archive's sanctum, would be told with more gravity than it deserved, for the archive itself was a living thing. Its walls, its floors, its air, and its memories all interacting with the group as if the entire building was listening to them, with the patience of a parent watching a child learn to walk. The gate opened with a sigh, as if the archive exhaled after years of holding its breath. Inside, the space was both immense and intimate. Shelves that rose to a ceiling that seemed to disappear into a watery depth. The shelves filled with memory objects, fragments of lives cut from a larger whole. Jars containing beginnings and endings that refused to be dismissed, and the soft hum of something like a heartbeat under the floor. They moved with gravity, with a reverent purpose, aware that every step could be a misstep, and that missteps were amplified inside a place designed to preserve memory as something sacred rather than as a tool to be wielded. A weave's invitation took shape in a way that felt almost musical, an arpeggio of memory, not a single note, but a chord that slowly grew until it filled the room with a brightness that could be felt in the skin. Then the archive, to their collective astonishment, answered back, not with a shout but with a resonance, the sense that a giant, invisible library had turned its attention toward them, and for a moment remembered that it, too, could be something other than a gatekeeper. It wasn't a memory in the sense of a memory of a person, but a memory of a possibility that the people could live without fear if they chose to wake the city, to wake themselves, into a reality where truth could surface without punishment. The resonance grew, not into a roar or a rebellion, but into a confident, patient kind of hope, and it lasted for just long enough for the group to understand that they had achieved something more dangerous and more beautiful than they had intended. They had made the city's memory look at itself and decide to stay awake. What followed was not a triumph march. It was an aftermath of a careful, careful quiet. The dome's watchers, who had begun to approach with the soft steps of those who believe they own the night, found themselves between something that looked like a coming storm and something that felt like a sunrise that would not be denied. The watchers did not draw arms immediately. They tested the air with a few signals, and then, with a disquieting sense that they could not fully control what was now in motion, they retreated to a room with glass walls and a view of the street, as if they needed to observe the ripples they could not immediately contain. The chorus dissolved into small clusters of movement and conversation, leaving behind a sense of having touched something that could never be taken back entirely. The memory of a possibility that could not be easily forgotten. Eira remained by the archive's entrance, momentarily still as a statue carved from stone that the sun had warmed into life. When she finally moved, it was with a new light in her eyes, the light of someone who had learned something essential. That truth had power when it is shared. That fear loses some of its bite when it is faced by a room full of ordinary people who refuse to surrender. Kai joined her a moment later. His face, which had once carried the lines of a man who had learned to survive by cunning, now cradled a different gravity, almost a tenderness that frightened him as much as it reassured him. He looked at the archive as if it had finally revealed a secret it hadn't intended to reveal, and perhaps that was the reason it looked back at him with a cautious warmth, rather than a cold indifference. "We did not steal anything," he said softly. "We offered something. We offered the city a way to remember. If they choose to act on it, it will be because the memory found a home in their hearts, not because we forced them to do so." Eira's reply was a smile, small and bright as a spark carried by her breath. "Hope is a dangerous ally," she said, almost to herself. "It makes you want to believe when the world is telling you not to. But it's still better than fear." Their voices were quiet for a long time after that, as the archive settled around them in its cradle of memory, and the city, so recently aroused from its long slumber, began to stretch, to test its limbs, to sense what else might be possible when people refused to treat truth as something to be hidden away. Then, just as dawn began to tint the city's pale skin with a pale gold, a new sound intruded, the sound of metal doors sliding along their tracks with a careful, inexorable precision. The dome's watchers had not left. They had found another way to enter. The click of metal on stone, a hiss of something pressed against the air, a breath of cool air that carried a faint tang of ozone, and something else, the taste of winter in the back of the throat. The group turned as one, their plans suddenly more fragile and more precious than ever. The overseers stood at the threshold, surrounded by a small squad of all too calm enforcers. Their faces hidden behind the sharp lines of their helmets, they did not rush in. They did not announce themselves with orders. They simply stood there, like a wall of night made flesh, watching the archive and the people who had chosen to challenge them. The moment stretched, the tension turning the room into a held breath. Then the alarm broke, the dome's silent, inescapable alarm, a note that didn't ring but hammered through the walls. It wasn't a siren exactly. It was the city's memory answering in its own way, a chorus of soft bells that rang out in various pockets of the archive. The watchers reacted with a military efficiency that suggested they had expected such a reaction, but they did not quite anticipate the weave's improvisation. In a heartbeat, the 5 witnesses, Farah, Bram, Lisa, Miro, and Nico found themselves not simply actors in a plan, but ligaments of a new kind of social organism, forming in real time. Their voices moved in a unified pulse that did not scream rebellion, but insisted on a new shared sense of possibility. The city responded in kind, the weave in the air gathering its breath around them, as if it too were listening, waiting to see if the memory could survive the dome's judgment. Kai and Eira stood at the edge of the light, watching as their plan refused to stay a plan any longer. It had become something else, an invitation, a memory, a declaration, that the city could choose its own path if it found the courage to do so. The overseers, confronted with this unanticipated, unquantifiable force, did not retreat, but they did falter. They spoke in controlled, measured tones, their voices carrying the cadence of years spent wielding power. They tried to reframe the moment as a temporary disturbance, a glitch in a system that was, after all, designed to be unbreakable. They did not admit defeat, but their confidence frayed, their commands came slower, and their eyes glasses, catching the light like a predator's, held something new, a flicker of uncertainty. In that moment, Eira felt the city's memory settle into a rhythm that wasn't hers to command, but which she could simply guide. She looked at Kai, and in his face, she read the same thing she felt in her own chest. The first clear breath of a future they hadn't dared to admit they believed in. A future that could be born if they kept moving, stayed together, and remembered to keep the memory spinning. Not as a weapon, but as a bridge. They did not know what would happen next. They did not know if the dome would decide to crush their memory, or whether the memory, once released into the city's bloodstream, would find its own shape and sway the people's hands. They could, at best, scheme and plan and hope. But they did know one thing with a clarity that burned away all the old fears. They had forged a fragile, stubborn thing, a memory lattice that would survive as long as they cared to feed it. They had created a chorus of voices that could not be silenced by fear alone, a chorus that could endure the city's scrutiny, a chorus that could someday grow into something more than a rumor, something that could change the city's heart. For now, the city slept with a new weight in its chest, a weight of memory, of possibility, of a plan that had learned to breathe. And in the quiet that followed, Eira raised her eyes to the dome and whispered a vow she did not know she would keep, that she would not forget what the city could be when it remembered how to dream again. Because if the memory could survive, if the memory could become something more than a secret kept in the walls of an old archive, then perhaps one day the people would wake and stand together beneath that pale, unanswerable sky and say, at last, with quiet courage and undeniable resolve, that their city was not just a machine for keeping order. It was a home made of stories, of memory, of a people who learned to listen when the weave sang. And so the night carried on, a long, patient, hopeful night, while the dome watched with its hard, calm eyes, and the city's heartbeat, faint at first, then growing steadier and louder, began to thrash with the first signs of life, a life that had chosen to break free, if only for a moment, from the bounds of fear. In those hours between the tremor of the first memory and the dawning of a new day, Kai found Eira again in the quiet corridor outside the archive. They stood side by side, not touching, but feeling the electricity between them, the unspoken acknowledgement that they had risked everything for something they couldn't quite fully name yet. "Where do we go from here?" she asked finally, her voice a blend of tired triumph and uncertain hope. He looked at her with something that might have been kindness, or maybe gratitude, or the heavy, stubborn patience of a man who had learned that the road to change was a long and winding one. "We go wherever the city lets us go next," he said. "We do not abandon the weave, and we do not abandon the people who put their trust in it. We stay close to the truth that memory can be gentled into courage, and we gather more voices, more memory, more songs. We keep moving until the dome's hush becomes a chorus, until the city's breathing grows in tempo and confidence, until one morning the memory has become the city's own memory and stops being a thing hidden away and becomes a living thing that belongs to everyone." Eira nodded slowly, the idea settling into her bones with a quiet, stubborn gravity. And memory's future was uncertain, the price of it unknown, and the risk of futility was real, but so was the possibility that the city could be saved not by force, but by the stubborn endurance of ordinary people who chose not to surrender to fear. "Then we begin again," she said, a soft, resolute whisper. "Yes," Kai replied, almost too softly to hear. Again and again. And so they moved forward, not as heroes or saviors, but as gatherers of a new sort of hope, the kind that grows in the interstice between truth and trust, the interstice where memory can bloom if people tend to it with care, attention, and a willingness to believe that the city, given a chance, might become something kinder than the fear that had once defined it. The dawn light thinned across the city's pale skin, and the dome's silhouette leaned a fraction closer to the waking street, as if listening for a chorus that might still be learning to sing. The memory had begun to take root, and though they could not yet see the complete shape of what it would become, there was a certainty in the air that something together they had built, something fragile, something imperfect, something hopeful, was enough to endure, at least for now. They did not know how many days of quiet lay ahead before the next test, or what new danger would threaten the fragile bridge they had laid between fear and memory. But as they stepped into the pale morning light, side by side but not touching, the city's breath seemed to slow for a heartbeat, then pick up again with a stubborn, resilient rhythm. It was a rhythm that told them, in a language older than fear and deeper than rumor, that the work of memory, of a city that could dream, would continue, would endure, and would someday become the city's own truth, spoken aloud by people who refused to forget. Their plan had not solved the city's problems in a single night, and it would not tomorrow or the next day. But in the quiet that comes after a storm, something had shifted, the sense that the truth was no longer a prisoner of the archive, no longer hidden behind the dome's watchful eye, but walking the streets in plain sight, carried by ordinary people who had learned that memory is power, and that power, when shared, becomes the seed of change. And so the story moved forward, not toward a singular decisive victory, but toward a future built out of countless small acts of courage, memory, and trust, the slow, necessary work of a city awakening to itself. One truth, one memory, one chorus at a time. The dawn that follows feels less like sunrise and more like a careful breathing of the city itself. Iron rails glint with a pale, patient light. Steam rises from vents like whispered confessions. Banners flutter with a rust-colored sheen, the color of old blood and renewed resolve. Iris Calder stands in the square where the city's heart used to drum with power and fear in equal measure. Now the drums beat in a gentler rhythm, the cadence of hands joining, of doors opening, of strangers recognizing each other as kin again. Iris feels the weight of this moment as if it were a glass orb balanced on her palm. If she tilts too far toward triumph, it shatters. If she shrinks back into caution, memory dies on the vine of quiet fear. Between those two dangers, she moves with the careful grace of someone who has learned to listen to the light in a cracked pane and still trust what it shows. The city's memory library, hollow and bright with the afterimage of 1,000 returned truths, houses the day's first confession, a girl with cheeks pale from sleep and hands stained with ink, telling the caretaker that she remembered her grandmother's kitchen, remembered the recipe for bread that never burned, remembered a story her grandmother used to tell of a city that learned to breathe again when it learned to listen. The memory librarian smiles with the ache of a throat that has learned to sing again after years of hush. Mara Ikeda, once a technician who could coax a turbine to speak in a voice it did not intend, now moves like water through the crowd, answering questions with the soft authority of someone who has learned that truth travels best when it travels light. She taps a small, battered device against the palm of her hand, a memory relay salvaged from the ruins of a forgotten factory. It hums to life, a wheeze that becomes a chorus as it begins to broadcast a pattern of memory across the public network, a mosaic of small, intimate recollections stitched together into something larger than any individual memory could hold. In the old mind of the city, a plan takes shape that sounds almost reckless when spoken aloud. To connect every memory, every choice, every mercy, every apology into a living mural that cannot be erased. The plan is not vengeance. It is a map, a way to walk towards something new without stepping again into the same trap of power that fed on silence. The first act of this act is a physical act of repair. Buried in the city's northern hill lies the anchor of the old memory grid, a stubborn thing of copper and glass that still remembers how to carry a voice across the long, quiet miles between neighborhoods. The archivist's last stand is here, where the grid begins and ends, where the old world and the new world meet in a tense, almost shy handshake. Meanwhile, Iris steps into the sunlit corridor of the central spire, the Together Building, as the people now call it, a place once rumored to store every voice the city had ever uttered and now repurposed to hold the shared breath of a waking metropolis. She carries with her a small metal box, not much larger than a child's lunch, wrapped in a strap of leather that has seen better days. It hums with a careful, almost frightened life. Inside, a tiny mechanism, no larger than a coin, becomes the heart of the city's re-embodiment, a device that can project memory in a way that feels tactile, letting a reader touch an image, an arrhyma, a fragment of sound, as if memory itself were a fabric that could be touched and rewoven. The archivist, the person who has stood in the shadows of this city's memory like a sentinel over a broken reliquary, appears with a shadow of a smile that does not quite reach the eyes. They have not come for a fight today. They come to offer a different bargain, not to erase, but to unbind. The archivist's real name is Neela Rook, a daughter of the city, who watched her family's own memory become a weapon in the hands of men who didn't understand what it means to be remembered. Today, Neela wears the same gray suit that many citizens wore when they learned to pretend they were strong enough to bear more than they could hold. Courage is not merely the absence of fear, Neela says, her voice soft enough to blend with the wind that slides between the square's stone pillars. Courage is the willingness to borrow another person's fear for a moment, long enough to see what lies beyond it. If you let me help you, Iris called her, we can unwrite the scripts that made fear a currency and memory a weapon. Iris studies Neela's face, the line of the jaw, the careful tilt of the eyes that have always looked at a future the rest of them were afraid to name. She sees her own memory in Neela's gaze, the moment when she learned the city's history is not a single chapter, but a chain of living, imperfect stories, each one braided with another. The city's healing will not be a single triumph, but a chorus of honest remembrance. Permission to speak plainly, Iris says, and the room, the hall with its glass roof that now frames a pale blue sky, leans closer to hear. The path you propose is not a line but a net. If we cast it wrong, we might strangle the very truths we seek to free. If we cast it right, we might unbind 1,000 hearts and finally teach a generation to trust again without fear. Neela nods, a fraction of a nod that means everything and nothing at once. Then we will begin with the smallest truth, she says. That is where life always begins. The memory of a grandmother's bread, the sound of rain on a tin roof, the taste of lilac in the late morning. We do not need to conquer to be safe. We need to remember so that we can choose what comes after. The plan unfolds in a series of meticulously ordinary acts that, when gathered, become something like a city remembering to clap again after a long silence. A teacher begins each class by inviting students to bring a memory they hold most dear. The moment a parent's voice calmed a fear, the scent of a neighbor's soup that promised warmth, the exact sound of a street vendor calling out a fruit they once loved. In the squares, people begin to tell stories aloud, stories that used to be whispered in kitchens and alleys, stories that used to vanish into the cold air of an unfriendly bureaucracy. Every act, a child's chalk drawing conserved by a harbor wind, a shopkeeper keeping his door open late to let a tired passerby step inside for tea, a nurse pausing to listen to a patient who would otherwise have been forgotten, becomes a thread in the city's new tapestry. The chorus that Iris envisioned emerges not as a single voice, but as a million soft, staggered notes, each one an invitation to remember and to trust again. As the memories spread outward, the old power structures tremble. The archivist's network, built from fear, intimidation, and the careful hoarding of secrets, frays at the edges as people rediscover their own competencies. The carpenter who can rebuild with scrap, the teacher who can craft a lecture from a memory, the grandmother who still remembers the old songs that once healed a neighborhood of its wounds. The enemies of memory discover that they no longer own the city's breath. The breath belongs to everyone who chooses to keep another's memory alive. In one tense afternoon, a confrontation erupts at the tower, where a guard of the old order tries to sever the memory lines that connect the city to its own heart. Iris and Neela, flanked by a dozen volunteers who now trust their own hands more than the promises of a distant, overconfident governor, stand before the tower. The device Iris carries, flat, round, modest in appearance, channels a light that travels through the air like a bird at dusk. A bird carrying names and dates and smiling faces. A bird that nests in the speaker's mouth and then flies out again into the square to perch on 1,000 shoulders. The tower's doors yield with a sigh not of defeat, but of exhaustion. The building's centuries-old bones, knowing they can no longer stand as the city's master. Inside, the air hums with something almost like a heartbeat, memory returning to the space itself. An echo of the city's life that had once been silenced. When the memory stream finally breaks through, it is not a single revelation, but a cascade of small, incandescent truths. A boy recalls a neighbor's kindness when his mother was sick. A street vendor remembers the day a siren did not come, and the city's firefighters did not rush out, because the memory of prior disasters compelled them to stay home and keep watch over their families. A woman remembers the exact scent of her grandmother's kitchen and the warmth of bread rising in the oven, and with that memory comes a realization that she does not need to be strong in isolation, she can be strong in community. The archivist Neela seems to melt into the light, as if a shadow no longer needed to be a shadow, when the city is learning to stand in the sun again. Memory is not a weapon, they say, not as a stone across Iris's path, but as a bridge to a future where even a city's fear can be carried without breaking its people. A city survives by being remembered when it is tempted to forget. They do not surrender their own power. They choose to relinquish the old tools of coercion and to join the chorus of shared memory. The moment of release comes when the last memory relay hums with a steady bright vibration and the square fills with the soft glow of 1,000 tiny lights. Memories crystallized into embers that float up and drift across rooftops, turning into living lanterns that spell out a single word across the dawn. Remember, the city gathers at the river as if drawn together by a long thread pulled taut by countless hands. The water glows with reflected memory, the shapes of a grandmother's hands kneading dough, of a neighbor's supper shared between two friends, of a letter that promised that tomorrow would be better if today's truth is spoken aloud. The river becomes a mirror in which every person sees a version of themselves that they could become, if they continue to choose memory over fear, trust over suspicion, solidarity over isolation. After the celebration, quiet now, almost ceremonial, the city begins to look beyond its own banks. The memory of who they were, who they could be, and what they owed to each other travels the air like seed. And a rumor of distant shores stirs. In the late afternoon, a carrier drone refurbished, repurposed lands on the square's edge, bearing a message from the city beyond the river, a city that has watched their awakening and is now ready to answer with its own chorus. Iris Lark, the woman who learned to listen to light through the cracked panes, steps forward to read the message aloud. The second city, the name spoken in a voice that is both a question and a promise. A city that did not forget to believe in memory, even when the world told it memory was a luxury or a weapon. The note ends with something neither triumph nor vengeance, but a question, a benediction of curiosity. Will you teach us to remember like this, so that we may remember together? The crowd's response is not a shout, but a rising tide of soft, confident voices. They answer with a chorus of ordinary miracles. The way a child's diddle becomes a map for grown-ups. The way an old baker shares a loaf with the stranger who sits on the curb long enough to listen. The way a memory that would have once caused pain now blooms into a reason to keep another person safe. Iris looks at Neela, the archivist who chose not to erase but to repair. We did not win a battle, Iris says, her voice steadier than it has ever been. We reclaimed a way of living. We chose to remember together instead of letting fear set the rules. This is the victory, the only victory that will endure, a city that chooses to be remembered and to remember others. A distant sound metal on stone, a ship's engines, sighing into new life, approaches from the horizon. It is the first signal of something larger than the city, something that asks for hospitality rather than conquest. The people do not recoil. They lean toward the thing that approaches, with the same careful curiosity with which they approached memory, with caution, with hope, with the promise that someone else, somewhere else, might also remember them correctly. And so the city does not end. It begins again, not as a flawless utopia, but as a living organism capable of learning to breathe in the fragile, luminous air of a truth that cannot be silenced. The memory network remains. The tribal divisions that once fed fear have begun to dissolve into a shared, imperfect, but resilient commonwealth. The future, once a rumor, is now a plan that borrows strength from every heart that has chosen to remember, and every hand that has chosen to lift another. In the last light of day, Iris raises her face to the pale blue sky and feels the city answering in kind, soft, patient, inexorable. The river's edge glitters with the memory of countless conversations that will be told again tonight in kitchens and schools, in workshops and cafes, in the quiet exchange of a neighbor's smile. The city does not pretend to be perfect. It does not pretend to be free of fear. It simply chooses to remember what fear forgets. That people, given room to recall who they are, will always choose to become more than they were. And if the others from the other city listen closely enough, they will hear the same chorus rise from their own streets, an invitation to remember, a promise to trust, a vow to stand together as the world grows larger than any one memory could hold. If they answer, perhaps a larger network of memory will spark to life, linking many cities into one enduring chorus, a chorus that will not be silenced again by any power that forgets the tenderness of a shared history. The horizon harbors more questions than answers, but the city's answer to every question is this: we will remember, we will trust, we will act with courage, even when courage is only a whispered breath in the presence of fear. And as night comes, the first stars begin to prick the dusk, tiny lighthouses for travelers from a far-off place who might one day arrive with their own stories and their own memories to contribute to the chorus. The city's lights waver small in number, bright in conviction, and the world beyond seems to lean closer, listening for the next note in a song that has only just begun.